They say she was queen for 9 days. But in truth, she never ruled a single hour of it. Because Lady Jane Grey wasn't a queen, she was a pawn. A child dressed in brocade, crowned with a title she never asked for. Seated on a painted wooden throne, only to be dragged down, blindfolded, and left groping for the execution block as she cried out in panic while everyone stood still. She was 17 when her head fell. And she didn't die because she did something wrong. She died because someone else was too afraid she might live. Or more precisely, too afraid of the symbol. She had become a crown placed on the wrong head at a time when England was burning in the fires of faith, ambition, and bloodlines. If she hadn't been born with Grey as her surname, if she hadn't been the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, if she hadn't been raised like a princess, fluent in Latin, Greek, and the scriptures, she might have lived longer. But everything about her life, her education, her marriage, her blood led her to a dark wooden block, where the axe would fall like a curse, and history would remember her not for what she did, but for how she died. It all began in the early years of the 16th century. Jane was born into a noble family, the daughter of Henry Grey and Frances Brandon herself, the granddaughter of Henry VII the Reeve Litter. Jane was not the daughter of a king, but royal blood flowed thick enough in her veins to make her valuable in Tudor society. Children like Jane were often sent to live with more powerful households, to be groomed, educated, and positioned for political marriage. Jane learned to behave like a noblewoman, but no one taught her how to survive a political coup. At 10 years old, Jane was placed in the household of Thomas Seymour, an ambitious man who had married Catherine Parr, the widow of Henry VIII. Seymour saw Jane as a valuable investment and wanted her matched with King Edward the sickly, young Protestant king with a crown and a ticking clock. Jane and Edward's relationship was a dream built by adults. But from that moment on, Jane was drawn into the dangerous orbit of the English throne, a place where marriage, blood, religion, and betrayal were always the stakes. When King Edward VI became gravely ill in the year 1553, he rewrote his will to bypass his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, citing both their illegitimacy and religious unsuitability. He wanted the crown to go to a Protestant, and eventually, he chose Jane, his Protestant cousin. With that stroke of a pen, Lady Jane Grey was named heir to the English throne, and her fate was sealed by a document she had never seen. She was married off to Lord Guildford Dudley, the son of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the most powerful man in England at the time. Jane was 16. Guildford was 18. It was not a marriage of love. It was a trap. 3 days after Edward died, Jane was brought to the Tower and proclaimed queen on the 10th of July, 1553. But there were no cheers, no fanfare, because the country waited to see what Mary, the Catholic daughter of Henry VIII, would do. The answer came 9 days later. Mary did not stay silent. She rallied troops, won the people, and declared herself the rightful queen. On the 19th of July, Jane was deposed. The crown disappeared like a mirage, and a darker chapter began. Jane and her husband were imprisoned in the Tower of London. At first, Mary seemed merciful. She allowed them to be held as nobles with their own rooms, servants, even access to the gardens. Jane stayed near Tower Green, while Guildford was held in Beauchamp Tower. But when Jane's father Henry Grey joined Wyatt's rebellion, an uprising meant to stop Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, everything changed. Jane, once a harmless cousin, became a political threat. Not because of anything she'd done, but because she still existed. Mary gave her one last chance. Convert to Catholicism, and you live. Jane, always devout, refused. She chose faith and death on the 12th of February, 1554. Jane was led to execution. She refused Guildford's request for a final meeting, saying their separation now would lessen the pain, for they would soon meet again in heaven. She saw his headless body being carried past her window. Witnesses said she cried out, "Guildford, Guildford," and then, 1 hour later, it was her turn. She wore black. She walked calmly. She prayed. She asked the crowd to join her in reading Psalm 51. When blindfolded, she could not find the block. She panicked. She cried, "What shall I do? Where is it?" No guard. No official. No lady-in-waiting moved, until a stranger from the crowd stepped forward, took her hand, and guided her to the place where her life would end. The axe fell. Jane was dead, 17 years old. They buried her beside Guildford, near Anne Boleyn, near Catherine Howard, 3 women executed for being too close to power. 11 days later, her father, the man who had offered her to the wolves, met the axe as well. Lady Jane, Grey Queen for 9 days, became the symbol of innocence, sacrificed in a world where no one innocent survives. And this is only the beginning. It did not begin with love. There were no poems, no letters exchanged by candlelight, no shared glances across ballrooms lit by chandeliers. There were only contracts, signatures, calculations, the kind that turned daughters into pawns and sons into bait. Lady Jane Grey was 16 years old when she was told she would marry Guildford Dudley. Not asked, not courted, told. Guildford was 18. The son of the most powerful man in England, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, the man who pulled the strings behind the throne of a dying king. And Jane, she was a bookish girl who loved Latin more than lace, who memorized psalms and debated scripture, who recoiled from attention and found solace, not in jewels or titles but in ink and silence. When her parents told her she was to marry Guildford, she fainted, and when she woke, the wedding still loomed, unchanged. The House of Dudley did not need Jane's heart. It needed her bloodline. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, in cousin to King Edward VI, and third in line to the throne, after Mary and Elizabeth. In an England ruled by uncertainty, Jane was a golden insurance policy, Protestant, well-educated, and most importantly, controllable. Her father, Henry Grey, was weak-willed and ambitious. Her mother, Frances, was known for her cruelty and coldness. Between them, Jane was pinned like a parchment under ink, her future written without pause. When the Dudleys proposed the match, the Greys didn't hesitate. They saw a crown gleaming on the horizon. Jane saw only a prison. The wedding took place in May of the year 1553. It was a grand affair, the kind meant to dazzle, to suggest power rather than love. Jane wore silver and white, her gown heavy with embroidery, her face a mask of obedience. Guildford looked every inch the son of a duke, handsome, tall, dressed in crimson velvet, but he was a boy with a mother who wielded him like a dagger, and a father who saw him as the future king of England. Their hands touched only briefly during the ceremony. They did not smile. Afterward, Jane was not taken to her own house but forced to remain with the Dudleys, where Guildford's mother, the Duchess of Northumberland, entreated her not like a daughter-in-law, but like a pawn on her own personal chessboard. Jane, who had once lived in quiet study, now found herself in a household of ambition, deceit, and whispers. She wrote to her tutors. She prayed. She asked to go home. But no one listened. Then came the letter. In early July, just 2 months after the wedding, King Edward lay dying. His body weakened. His mind still sharp, desperate to keep the country in Protestant hands. He signed his final version of the device for the succession. In it, he named Jane, not Mary, not Elizabeth as his heir. Northumberland had prepared for this moment. He had already married his son to the girl with the claim. Now all that remained was to wait. Edward died on the 6th of July. Jane was not told immediately. On the 9th, she was summoned to Sion House. She thought it was for another lecture, another ceremony, another hollow gesture from her ambitious parents. But what she was told was this: "You are now Queen of England." Jane, stunned, pale, trembling, fell to the ground. "The crown is not my right," she whispered. "It pleases me not." But no one heard her. Or rather, they heard and ignored. Her mother, her father, the Dudleys, even Archbishop Cranmer all nodded solemnly, urging her to accept what had been divinely ordained. Her refusal meant nothing. Her crown was already forged. On the 10th of July, Jane entered the Tower of London as a queen. Guildford rode beside her, wearing robes of state. But this was no coronation. It was a staging ground. Northumberland needed Jane in the Tower, because that was where new monarchs were traditionally housed before their coronation. He needed Guildford close to her, so that when the time came, he could push for him to be crowned king. Jane resisted even then. She said Guildford should not be made king. She called him my husband, but never his grace. For the first time, she showed the steel beneath the silk. She would wear the crown, but she would not let herself be used any more than she already had been. But it was too late. Outside the Tower, England stirred. News spread fast. Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, half-sister to Edward. I heard of her disinheritance and rode north. Her supporters gathered by the thousands. The people, many of them Catholic, saw in her the true heir. The streets buzzed with tension. Letters flew from house to house. Nobles began switching sides. Soldiers began questioning orders. And Jane, still only 16, sat inside stone walls and tried to understand what was happening beyond them. She spent much of her 9 days as queen in prayer. She read her Bible. She asked for reports. Guildford, meanwhile, sulked. He demanded to be made king. When Jane refused, he went to his mother, who demanded it in his name. Jane did not yield. It was one of the few choices she ever made freely, and it would cost her. On the 19th of July, Mary entered London. The crowds roared. The Privy Council deserted Jane and declared for Mary. Northumberland, realizing his plan had failed, tried to flee and was arrested. Jane, once again, fainted. When she awoke, she was no longer queen. She was a prisoner. She and Guildford were taken from their chambers, stripped of their royal titles, and locked in separate cells within the Tower. The same building that had once offered Jane a view of her city now became a place of dread. Her name was removed from coins. Her proclamation annulled. Her supporters hunted, but for a time, she was spared. Mary, now Queen of England, hesitated. Perhaps she saw in Jane a reflection of herself young, used, wronged. Mary ordered that Jane be treated gently. She allowed her books, her prayers, even walks in the Queen's garden. She allowed Guildford to remain in the tower, but not near Jane. For months, they lived like shadows behind stone. But peace is short in palaces. In January of the year 1554, Mary announced her intention to marry Philip of Spain, a Catholic prince. The country erupted. Many feared a return to Catholic oppression. Many feared Spanish control. Among them was Jane's father, Henry Grey. And so he joined a rebellion. Wyatt's rebellion aimed at stopping the marriage. Though Jane had no part in it, though she was still imprisoned and powerless, her very existence became dangerous once more. Mary, now rattled and desperate to keep her crown, was told by her advisers, as long as Jane lives, she is a symbol. She must die. At first, Mary resisted. She offered Jane a way out. Convert to Catholicism. Publicly repent. Accept the Pope's authority. Jane refused. Her faith, like her fate, was unshakable. I am a true Christian woman, she said, and I look to be saved by none other means but by the mercy of God and the merits of his only Son. Her words, spoken in sorrow, sealed her end. And what of Guildford? He asked to see her one last time. She said no. It will only increase our pain. She replied, let us meet soon in another place, where death cannot part us. In that refusal was not coldness, but clarity. Jane, still only 16, had lived enough lifetimes to know that one more goodbye would break her. And she had already been broken enough. She spent her final night writing letters. To her sister, to her father, to Mary. She asked for forgiveness. She wrote out psalms in her own hand. She clutched her little prayer book like a shield. Outside, the scaffold was being built. Morning would come soon. And with it, the blade. She did not sleep. Or if she did, it was the kind of sleep that lives on the edge of dreams, where every creak of stone and every bird's cry outside the tower walls felt like a summons. When the guards came for Guildford first, she did not cry. She moved to the window. From the upper room where she was kept at number 5 Tower Green, she could see across the courtyard to Tower Hill, though not the block itself. The bells rang. The murmurs of the crowd rose like a tide. And then there was silence. A silence so complete, it pressed against her chest. They brought his body back in a cart. She saw the white cloth over what was no longer a face, the blood seeping through the linen, the arms folded, the head placed beside the torso, and something inside her cracked. Not with sound, but with stillness. Guildford, she whispered. Guildford. And then she turned away from the window and did not look again. An hour later, they came for her. She dressed herself in black. No jewels. No crown. No pretense. Just dignity. Her ladies wept around her as they fastened the last ties of her gown, as they placed her headdress, as they smoothed the fabric of her collar. She held her prayer book close, pressed it against her chest. I'd a true Christian woman, she had written the night before, and I look to be saved by none other means but by the mercy of God. She walked through the cold corridors with calm steps, her shoes clicking softly against the stone, and ascended the scaffold, built hastily atop the Tower Green, a place soaked with the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. The crowd gathered, hushed and anxious. Jane turned to them not as a queen, not even as a prisoner, but as a soul, unafraid. She gave no long speech, only quiet words that trembled, not with fear, but with resolution. "I am come hither to die," she said, "and by a law I am condemned to the same." She declared herself innocent of any true crime, claimed only the mercy of her God, and thanked him, yes, thanked him for granting her time to repent. Then she turned to the executioner. He stepped forward to help untie her gown. But she pulled away and said, with quiet strength, "Leave me. I will do it myself. I am not accustomed to be undressed by strangers." Her ladies took her headdress, her gloves, her collar. One of them began to sob. Unable to stop, Jane touched her hand gently and whispered something no one else could hear. The block stood bare before her. She knelt. The executioner asked her forgiveness, and she gave it without pause. Then he handed her the blindfold. She took it with trembling fingers and placed it over her eyes herself. And there, for the first time, she faltered, in darkness. She reached out. Her hands groped through the air, fumbling, trembling. "What shall I do?" she cried out. "Where is it the officials? The priest?" Even her ladies, they stood frozen, helpless. No one moved. No one stepped forward. The girl who had been called queen, who had been stripped of title and hope, now knelt, blind and alone. The moment stretched. Her voice cracked again. "Where is it?" And then a stranger, a man in the crowd, someone not named, never recorded. He stepped forward, unable to bear it, and guided her hands to the block. Just like that. No trumpet, no drama, just human mercy. She placed her head in the curve of the wood. Her prayer book lay beside her, its pages fluttering in the breeze. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell. There was no second blow. The body of Lady Jane Grey, queen for 9 days. Prisoner for 7 months. Martyr in the minds of some and forgotten ghost. To others lay still, her blood soaked into the green grass. Her legacy, if it could be called, that had already begun to fade even before the last breath left her lungs. Before nightfall, she was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, just feet from the bones of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. No monument marked her grave. No grand epitaph carved in marble. Only dust, and the whisper of her name on the lips of those who wondered what she might have become, had she not been born a girl with royal blood in the wrong century. 11 days later, her father, Henry Grey, was brought to the same block. He died as quietly as his daughter, and was buried near her. It was, in a cruel and bitter sense, a family reunion. But Jane's story would not remain buried. Whispers persisted in Protestant sermons, in foreign courts, in ballads and pamphlets of the girl who died for someone else's ambition. Some called her saint. Some called her fool. But all agreed on one thing. She never wanted the crown. And in the end, she never truly wore it. Only the shadow. Only the weight. Only the price. Before she was queen. Before the axe. Before the cold silence of Tower Green swallowed her name into history, Jane Grey was simply a girl trying to survive, a marriage she never chose, in a house where every wall whispered of power and every corridor carried footsteps that weren't hers. When her wedding to Guildford Dudley was over, when the robes were hung and the music stopped, she wasn't taken home to her own family. She was escorted to the grand, a cold home of her new in-laws, the Dudleys, and placed firmly under the thumb of the most calculating woman in England, her mother-in-law, the Duchess of Northumberland. That house was not a place of warmth. It was not a place where new brides were celebrated, or where a shy, bookish girl could flourish. It was a fortress of ambition, a nest where every breath Jane took was measured, judged, politicized. The Duchess ran her household like a military campaign. She did not see Jane as a daughter, nor even as a woman. She saw her as a vessel, a stepping stone, a shortcut to a crown, to the outside world. Jane was now part of the most powerful family in the realm. But inside those walls, she was little more than a prisoner in silk. Guildford, her husband, was no better. He was proud, spoiled, and driven by a sense of entitlement, sharpened by years of being told he would one day sit on the throne. He was not cruel, but he was cold, vain, hungry. He expected Jane to treat him like a king, and when she did not, when she chose to study, to pray, to retreat inward, instead of entertain his moods, he sulked. He complained to his mother. He turned cold eyes on the girl who had been forced to become his wife. Jane, for her part, endured. It was what she had been raised to do. She rose early, read the scriptures, wrote letters to her tutors. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when she did speak, it was with quiet clarity, the voice of someone who saw too much and was never asked what she thought. She did not love Guildford. She did not want to rule. She only wanted peace. But peace, in those days, was rarer than rubies. Then came the fevered rush, the palace messengers, the scribbled letters, the whisper of illness in the halls of Whitehall. King Edward VI was dying. The boy king, just 15, had grown pale and thin, coughing blood, wasting away under the weight of his crown and his beliefs. And in his final days, the men who surrounded him, chief among them, John Dudley, plotted how to use his death to seize the future. Dudley convinced the king to name Jane as heir, a Protestant girl, his own daughter-in-law, married already to Dudley's son. It was perfect, clean, cold, calculated. No one asked Jane. When the summons came for her to appear at Sion House, she thought it would be another lesson, another empty show of courtesy. Instead, she was told that the king had died, and that she, Jane, was now Queen of England. Her knees buckled. She collapsed. She later wrote that she had never wanted the crown, never dreamed of it. She begged for time to pray, to think. But time was not something offered to girls like Jane. The decision had already been made by fathers and dukes, by councils and signatures. She would wear the crown, or she would be nothing. And so, on the 10th of July, she was taken to the Tower of London. The ride there was quiet, but the silence carried a pressure Jane had never known before. People watched her from windows, unsure whether to bow or look away. Her mother wept or pretended to. Her father rode proudly. Guildford, dressed in fine red, sat tall on his horse. Smug, Jane stared at the stones of the street, her hands folded tight in her lap. She felt no joy, no triumph, only a sinking dread, like a cold weight, pressing at her chest. Inside the tower, she was housed in the royal apartments, the same rooms where queens before her had dressed for coronation, the same halls where Anne Boleyn had once walked, barefoot, to her execution. Jane felt the air thick with ghosts. She was crowned in name only. There was no coronation, no crown placed on her head, just proclamations, just papers, and the quiet expectation that she would now rule. But Jane refused to play along. When Guildford demanded to be crowned king alongside her, she said no. When the Duchess of Northumberland screamed that her son deserved to be called His Majesty, Jane stood her ground. "I will not make him king," she said, calm but immovable. It would be a breach of law. It was the first and only time Jane ever defied her mother-in-law. It was a spark, a flicker of spine, in a world that thought her meek. It cost her dearly. Guildford turned cold. He refused to dine with her. The Dudleys seethed. And still, Jane prayed. She wrote letters to her cousin, Princess Elizabeth, perhaps sensing that her reign would be measured in days, not years. She did not order executions. She did not pass laws. She simply waited, as the shadow of Mary Tudor grew closer with each day. Outside the tower, the people murmured. Mary had fled to East Anglia and was raising an army. Jane's name meant little to the crowds. Mary's name, however, echoed with the memory of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish queen, the wronged wife, the mother of the Catholic heir. Thousands rallied to her side. Nobles switched allegiance. The Privy Council began to waver. Inside her stone cage, Jane read the Bible and listened for news. Every night. And she prayed for mercy, for clarity, for deliverance. On the 19th of July, the dream ended. The Privy Council abandoned her. The guards switched sides. The tower bells rang not for her, but for Mary. Jane, still barely 16, was informed that she was no longer queen. The guards took her crown, her seals, her title. Guildford was arrested. Jane, trembling, was placed under arrest. Her ladies wept as her name was scrubbed from the proclamations. She did not resist. She only bowed her head, folded her hands, and whispered a prayer. Her reign had lasted 9 days. Not a single law passed. Not a single war waged. Not a single soul saved. And yet, it would cost her everything. For in England then, as now, a crown, once worn, cannot simply be set aside. It must be taken. Blood must be spilled. And the girl who had once refused to make her husband king would now wait, silently, for the day they would come to take her head. She was no longer queen, but she was still a threat. Jane Grey, barely 16, sat in the silence of her chamber in the tower. She no longer had access to the Queen's garden. Her rooms grew colder. Her guards grew keener. Her name, once printed across proclamations and shouted in city squares, was now only whispered or not spoken at all. And yet, she lived. That alone was a danger, because in the turbulent waters of Tudor politics, a living rival was more treacherous than a dead one, especially when she had royal blood, especially when she had once worn the crown. Even for 9 days, Mary Tudor, now Queen Mary I, hesitated. She had won the throne through popular support and bloodless force. The people adored her, at least for now. And Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was a woman raised in exile and sorrow. She had known powerlessness. She had known fear. And perhaps in Jane, she saw a reflection of herself. A girl sacrificed for dynastic ambition. A child caught between crowns and creeds. Perhaps, for a while, Mary believed she could show mercy, that she could be the queen who spared the innocent. So Jane was not executed. Not yet. She remained confined in the tower, but was treated with a strange, uneasy dignity. Her small circle of attendants were allowed to stay. She was given books. She continued to write, to pray, to study. She read psalms aloud. She composed letters In trembling Latin, she comforted her ladies. Even as they grew more pale by the day, Guildford was locked away in another tower. Alone. Furious. Sobbing behind closed doors. Jane asked for nothing, and expected nothing, until the rebellion. In January of the year 1554, Mary announced her plan to marry Philip of Spain, son of Charles V, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe. England reeled. The country was not ready for a Spanish king. The nobles feared foreign rule. The Protestants feared religious persecution. And in this atmosphere of dread, men plotted. Among them, heartbreakingly, fatefully, was Jane's own father. Henry Grey had once sold his daughter into an arranged marriage. He had once paraded her as queen, knowing full well it would place her in danger. He had abandoned her in the tower, pleading his own innocence while she awaited judgment. And now, as the realm bristled at the idea of a Spanish prince on an English throne, he joined the uprising known as Wyatt's Rebellion, hoping to prevent the marriage and restore Protestant rule. But he did not do this for Jane. He did it for himself. For power. For fear. For pride. And in doing so, he signed her death warrant. The rebellion failed. Quickly. Brutally. Thomas Wyatt and his forces were captured. Henry Grey was arrested. And though Jane had no role in the uprising, though she had written no letters, raised no army, spoken no public word, her name became toxic again. She was no longer a girl who had made a mistake. She was a symbol, a rallying cry, a living alternative to Mary. And to let her live was now too dangerous. Mary hesitated again. The Queen's conscience struggled. She consulted her council. They urged swift execution. She prayed. She paced. She wept. She offered Jane a way out, a private conversion, a quiet retraction of faith, a whispered return to Rome. But Jane refused. She was no longer just a girl. She was, in her own eyes, a Protestant martyr. She would not bend. She would not kneel to the Pope. She would not buy her life at the cost of her soul. And so Mary signed the warrant. On the morning of the 12th of February, 1554, Guildford was taken first. Jane watched from her window as his headless body was returned from Tower Hill in a cart. She had refused to see him that morning. Not out of cruelty, but out of mercy. It would only increase our misery. She had told the guards, "Let us meet soon in another place." And now, as she watched the crimson-soaked cloth covering what remained of her husband, her lips moved in silent prayer, but her hands did not tremble. She had accepted this end. An hour later, they came for her. She had dressed herself in black. She carried her prayer book. Her ladies clung to her arms, trying to hold her, as if that could stop time. She climbed the scaffold with slow, deliberate steps. She made no grand speech. Her words were quiet, simple. She spoke of Christ, of mercy, of repentance. She confessed her sins, not treason, but pride, selfishness, neglecting the word. She thanked God for the time to prepare her soul. She forgave the executioner, and then she tied her own blindfold. The rest, history remembers too well. The fumbling hands, the whispered panic, the searching fingers. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she cried. Lost in darkness. And still no one moved. Until a stranger, unnamed, perhaps a soldier or a servant, stepped forward and placed her hands on the block. She knelt. She whispered her last words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And then the axe. Mary wept when she heard the news. Or so they say. But the deed was done. England had chosen a queen. And the other girl, the girl who never wanted to rule, lay buried in the chapel beside Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, and Guildford Dudley. But in time, Jane's name would become something else. Not a queen, not a traitor, but a question. What if she had lived? What if she had ruled? What if mercy had won? There was no statue, no tomb carved in alabaster, no golden epitaph etched above her resting place for Lady Jane Grey, the queen who reigned for 9 days and died before her 17th spring had faded. There was only a slab of stone inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, unmarked and shared with other women whose stories ended beneath the swing of the axe. She was buried beside Guildford Dudley, beneath the shadow of the tower that had first called her sovereign, then prisoner, then ghost. The bells did not ring for her. The court wore no black. The pages of the chronicle moved on, as if she had been a misprint in the margins of history. But the silence did not last. In the years that followed, whispers returned to her name. Some called her martyr. Some called her a warning. To the Protestants, rising under Elizabeth, Jane became a symbol, not of rebellion, but of unjust sacrifice. She was the pious girl who had died with scripture on her lips and no blood on her hands. The girl who had stood her ground in a storm of betrayal, who had refused to bow to a false doctrine, even when salvation was offered in exchange for her soul. And so in sermons, her story was resurrected not as politics, but as parable. But beyond the pulpit, Jane's story remained deeply, achingly personal. She had been a daughter, a student, a girl who loved books more than pageantry, whose only crime was being born in the wrong place, with the wrong name, during the wrong war of religion. She had not fought for the throne. She had never asked to be queen. Every decision, the marriage, the crown, the resistance had been made for her, and still, she bore the punishment. Her parents outlived her. Frances Grey, her mother, returned to court under Queen Mary's favor, remarried, and lived without punishment. She never built a monument to her daughter, never publicly wept, never wrote a line of mourning. Her father, Henry Grey, had joined the rebellion that sealed Jane's fate and was executed 11 days after her. But even he, in his final confession, spoke little of his daughter. Perhaps he was ashamed. Perhaps he had numbed himself beyond grief. Or perhaps, like so many nobles of the Tudor court, he had simply learned to survive without memory. Jane's sisters, Catherine and Mary, lived long enough to see Elizabeth rise, long enough to understand what might have been. Catherine, spirited and bold, and would later marry in secret and be imprisoned for it. Mary, tiny and fragile from birth, would live in the shadows. Neither spoke often of Jane, but in private letters, there are echoes, lines of longing, scraps of regret. What Jane never had was closure. She never got to write her final thoughts beyond the small pages of her prayer book. Never was permitted to send a last letter to Elizabeth, though she tried. Never spoke her full truth in a world that only wanted her silence. What remains of her voice survives in fragments, a few lines recited on the scaffold, the notes she left her sister, the psalm she read with trembling lips as the crowd watched. Psalm 51. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Words chosen not out of fear, but out of faith. In the centuries that followed, writers and poets tried to give Jane the ending history denied her. Painters imagined her on the scaffold, eyes lifted to heaven, calm, and pure, lit by holy resignation. Playwrights turned her into a tragic heroine. Historians tried to untangle the motives of those who used her. But always, at the center of the storm, there remained a quiet girl with hands bound and a voice raised only in prayer. She could have lived, had Mary chosen mercy over vengeance, had her father remained loyal, had her husband not been born a Dudley, had Edward named no successor, had the Reformation waited just one more decade, Jane Grey might have lived. But she did not. And so, she became legend. In Westminster Abbey, where kings and queens lie beneath marble and gold, there is no statue of Lady Jane Grey, but inside the tower, in that small chapel, where the walls remember more blood than prayer, a single plaque bears her name. Simple, bare. It reads, "Near this spot lies Lady Jane Grey." Not queen, not martyr, just Jane. But those who know the story know the truth. She was crowned against her will, betrayed by blood, denied love, and condemned by fear. She walked to her death with dignity. She held fast to her faith, and in doing so, she became something no crown could grant, and no axe could sever, unforgotten. And it is in that silence, not the shouting of kings or the marching of armies, where the real power of Jane Grey lives. In the hush between prayers, in the breath before the blade, in the space history left behind, where a girl once whispered her last words into a sky that could not answer, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And the tower, for once, listened. Time in England does not stop for the dead. Crowns pass from one head to another. The court whispers a few prayers. The scaffold is scrubbed clean. And by the next dawn, the same stones bear new footsteps. Yet beneath those same stones, in the chapel where the cold air smells faintly of dust and iron, the bones of Lady Jane Grey have never been still, because though England buried her body, it could not bury the unease she left behind, the guilt that crept through the corridors of Whitehall, the shame that flickered in the Queen's eyes each time a Protestant hymn was whispered, the ghost of a girl who had never wanted what she died for. Mary Tudor tried to forget her. She focused on her marriage to Philip of Spain, on restoring the Catholic faith, on building a world where the Pope's blessing mattered more than England's conscience. But it never quite worked. The marriage soured quickly. The people turned restless. And in the hearts of those who had watched Jane die, the quiet citizens, the scholars, the ministers, the story of the 9-day queen began to grow into something else, something dangerous. Jane became a name, spoken softly in Protestant homes, a reminder of innocence murdered by authority, of conviction silenced by power. And though no one dared to call her a martyr aloud, they all remembered her youth, her poise, the way she forgave her executioner before the axe fell. Mary's reign grew heavy with ghosts, the burnings of heretics, the smoke rising over Smithfield, the faces of men and women condemned for the same faith Jane had refused to renounce. Sometimes the stories said that Mary dreamt of her cousin, that she saw her in the tower corridors, in the flicker of candles near the chapel, a pale figure with folded hands, and a voice that asked softly, "Where is it?" The same words she had cried on the scaffold, when blindfolded and alone. But ghosts are not what haunt kings and queens. Memory does. And Mary, the woman who had once shown mercy, could not erase the feeling that in killing Jane, she had killed the one part of herself that had once been innocent. She aged faster after that winter. Her health withered. Her marriage failed. The people whispered again. And by the time Mary died, England was ready to forget her, but not the girl she had destroyed. Then came Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose bones rested beside Jane's took the throne. She was clever, cautious, and more like Jane than she would ever admit. Elizabeth restored Protestantism, but did not speak of the 9-day queen. She understood the danger of memory, how it could inflame the wrong hearts, how it could turn saints into weapons. So she buried Jane again. This time, in silence. No monument. No ceremony. No formal pardon. Just omission. But silence does not erase a life. It only preserves it differently. Décades passed. The tower stood. The chapel remained, and the story of Lady Jane Grey began to slip free from the hands of politics and into the realm of legend. Painters painted her as an angel serene, haloed, white as light. Poets called her the innocent lamb. Chroniclers softened her face, made her wiser than her years, purer than truth, as if trying to balance the brutality of what had been done with the gentleness of what they wished had been. Yet the truth is quieter, more human. Jane was not a saint. She was not fearless. She was a frightened girl, trembling in her last hour, groping for a wooden block she could not see. She prayed because she believed, but she also prayed because she was terrified. She forgave because she was raised to forgive. She spoke gently because her voice had never been heard. And that, perhaps, is what made her unforgettable, not perfection, but the ache of her humanity in a world that devoured the gentle. Sometimes visitors to the tower still say they feel her there, in the chapel. A sudden chill, a whisper at the edge of hearing, a hand brushing against the pews. The guards say that every February, near dawn, the air grows colder by her grave, as if something still waits, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for remembrance. For Jane Grey was never truly avenged, nor fully mourned. History swept her into the folds of Tudor tragedy, a name between greater names, Henry, Mary, Elizabeth, yet somehow, she lingers more vividly than most, because she represents something the others could never hold: purity without power, faith without cruelty, courage without victory. She ruled for 9 days. She lived 17 years. But she endures across centuries, not as a queen of crowns and courts, but as a queen of quiet, of grace under terror, of dignity and defeat, of truth, whispered in a world too loud to listen. And if you stand in that chapel long enough, in the hour just before the city wakes, when the bells of London are still and the mist curls low against the stones, you might imagine hearing it: a soft voice, calm, unhurried, almost at peace, saying the same words she spoke on that February morning long ago: Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And for one heartbeat, it feels as though England still listens. The Tower of London has never been a place of peace. It breathes history in sighs and echoes, in the quiet creak of old wood and the chill that seeps up through the stones. It has held kings and queens, traitors and martyrs, and the restless ghosts of those who were neither one nor the other. Yet among all those who died there, none haunted quite like Lady Jane Grey, not because of vengeance or violence, but because of silence, the kind that follows injustice, the kind that never fades. After her death, the tower did not change. The guards still marched. The ravens still circled. The river still lapped at the cold foundation stones. But every February, as the mists rose from the Thames, the yeomen who kept watch began to notice it, the way the air stilled around the chapel, the way footsteps echoed, even when the halls were empty. Some said it was imagination. Others swore they saw her not in white robes, not in royal finery, but in black, carrying her little prayer book, her head slightly bowed, walking the same slow path she had taken to the scaffold centuries before. She never looked up. She never spoke, only walked, again and again, toward the place where she had said her last prayer. The tower has kept many secrets, but Jane's is different. It is not the secret of conspiracy or betrayal, but of innocence, lost and quietly remembered. For though her body was buried beneath the floor of St. Peter ad Vincula, the story of her life remained buried deeper, still suppressed first by Queen Mary, who wanted no rival legend, then by Elizabeth, who feared a Protestant martyr would overshadow her, and finally by the centuries themselves, which forgot how to feel pity for a girl too pure to survive in a court that thrived on cunning. And yet the tower remembered. When the stones of the Beauchamp Tower cracked, when the etchings of prisoners' names began to fade, the warders found one faint mark carved into the wall, a cross, small and simple, and beside it the letters J. G. They could not prove it was hers. Perhaps it belonged to another prisoner, another Jane. But still, visitors whispered that it was her farewell, her final act of defiance against being erased. The mark remains there even now, worn smooth by centuries of fingertips, tracing it in silence. Not far from that wall stands the window where she once watched her husband's body carried away. The glass has long been replaced, but when the sun strikes it at a certain hour, that dim, gold hour between dawn and morning, a reflection flickers across the floor that looks, for a breath, like the shape of a kneeling girl. Tourists snap photographs. Guides lower their voices, but the legend persists. The tower itself does not forget the ones who died unjustly within its walls. History tried to soften her, to fold her story into the gentle poetry of martyrdom. But the truth that lingers in those stones is harsher. Jane was not some saint frozen in faith. She was a child who was betrayed by every adult who ever claimed to love her. Her parents, who traded her for power. Her husband's family, who used her name to catch a crown. The council, who abandoned her the moment the wind changed. Even her cousin Mary, who could have chosen mercy, but chose survival instead. Every stone in that tower knows that kind of betrayal. That is why, they say, the tower will never let her go. Sometimes, at night, when London sleeps and the city hum fades to silence, the guards say they can hear a voice from the chapel, a faint whisper, not weeping, but reciting a psalm, steady and soft. Psalm 51. Always the same one. Have mercy upon me, O God. The words echo through the narrow aisles, rising and falling with the wind, until they blend with the sound of the river outside. The yeomen call it the prayer of the 9 days. They never speak of it loudly. It is not a ghost story to them. It is a confession from the past that refuses to die, and maybe that is why people still go there. Hundreds of years later, not to gawk at the crown jewels or to count the ravens, but to stand in that quiet chapel and feel what the tower still remembers: the weight of a girl's courage, the stillness of her faith, the tremor in her last breath. Some say that if you stay long enough, if you close your eyes and let the chill wrap around you, you can almost feel her presence, not haunting, not angry, just there, like a candle in the dark, flickering but unextinguished, because the Tower of London may have hidden her body, may have silenced her name for a century or two, but it could never undo the one thing that outlived every queen and every council: the memory of a 17-year-old girl who met her death with grace. And if you listen, not with your ears, but with that quiet place in the chest where stories settle and stay, you might still hear her walking, slow, steady, through the corridors of stone, past the archways and the carved names, toward the green where the grass has grown over the blood, always walking, always praying, never forgotten. Centuries rolled forward, and England changed its skin like a serpent shedding guilt. Kings died. Queens were crowned. Churches rose and fell. Empires bloomed and broke. Yet the story of Lady Jane Grey never faded completely. It remained like smoke in the rafters of history. Impossible to hold. Impossible to erase. Even when her name was missing from official chronicles, even when her face was painted wrong in portraits too serene, too saintly, the truth still moved underneath. Patient as breath. For every age, it seemed, and needed her again. The scholars searching for moral clarity. The poets longing for purity. The women who read her letters and saw in her a mirror of their own small, voiceless rebellions. In the reign of Elizabeth, Jane's name was spoken only in whispers. It was dangerous to recall the girl whose death had been the final stain on Mary's conscience. But even Elizabeth could not quite silence the memory. Sometimes, when foreign ambassadors brought gifts to the English court, they would mention her delicately, as one mentions a ghost who might still be listening. Her Majesty's cousin, they would say. The 9-day queen, whose faith never broke. Elizabeth would tighten her jaw and move on, her eyes distant, as if she too could see that February morning, still echoing in the frost. For she knew, better than anyone, how thin the line was between queen and corpse. Years later, under James, then under Charles, Jane's story was told again, reshaped, romanticized, retold to suit each generation's need for a moral. The Protestants called her martyr. The Catholics called her victim. The humanists called her scholar. Painters imagined her in white silk, illuminated like a saint, about to be crowned by heaven. Playwrights gave her words she never spoke, serenity she never felt. But the real Jane, the trembling girl with bound eyes and searching hands, always hid between the lines, refusing to be fully claimed by any one truth. When the English Civil War erupted a century later, pamphleteers invoked her name again. Remember Jane Grey. They wrote, the girl who would not bow. Her story became a warning against tyranny, then a parable of conscience, then a whisper of faith. And through each retelling, one thing remained, unchanged. Her death had meaning, but not the kind her killers intended. The axe that silenced her had turned her voice into something indestructible. By the 19th century, her image was everywhere. The Victorians, obsessed with virtue and tragedy, painted her endlessly, the soft-faced girl kneeling at the block, her gown spilling like light, her ladies fainting behind her, the executioner's arm trembling mid-air. Paul Delaroche's great canvas, The Execution of Lady Jane Grey, hung in London like a sacred relic, and thousands came to stare at her face, frozen between life and death. Some wept, some prayed, some simply stared, as if hoping to learn what courage looked like. The truth was that they all saw what they wanted to see, purity in an impure world. But history, a saber, kept its irony. The more they painted her, the less they remembered her. The more they sanctified her, the less they understood her humanity. The girl who had once been flesh and fear and heartbeat became myth, gilded and untouchable. And myths, like crowns, are heavy things. They crush the real. Yet the tower still remembered the real Jane, the frightened breath, the small prayer, the grace under terror. It remembered the scent of candle wax and wet stone, the rustle of her gown as she knelt, the murmurs of the crowd, the single voice that stepped forward to guide her hand. Every February, the chill returns, and the yeomen still tell the same story, not as spectacle, but as confession. When they speak her name, it is soft, as if afraid the stones might answer. And perhaps they do, for even now, when the winter fog rolls up from the Thames and wraps the tower in silver mist, visitors say the chapel grows colder, the air stiller. The candles flicker though no wind blows. They speak of a presence not frightening, not vengeful, but watchful. A girl of 17, walking through eternity, still holding her little book, still whispering the words that outlived her. Have mercy upon me, O God. If ghosts are the echoes of what the living cannot forget, then Lady Jane Grey is not a ghost, but a memory made flesh. She does not haunt for vengeance. She lingers for meaning. She walks not because she was wronged, but because she was silenced, and silence, in time, becomes its own kind of endurance. And so the centuries have kept her the scholars who studied her letters, the artists who painted her light, the dreamers who wondered what might have been if mercy had triumphed over fear. Her name, once whispered in dread, became a prayer. Her story, once buried, became the proof that even in a world ruled by blades and crowns, grace could still exist. Because in the end, Lady Jane Grey's legacy is not the throne she lost, nor the death she met, but the calm with which she faced both. And when the bells of London ring across the river at dawn, when the fog lifts from the green, when the first sunlight strikes the tower walls, it feels for a moment as if she never left at all. For England has many queens, but only one who learned to rule in the instant she died. If history were a book written by compassion instead of conquest, the story of Lady Jane Grey would not end with the axe. It would end here in the stillness that follows centuries, in the quiet place between memory and forgiveness, where the soul no longer trembles. For even now, when all the kings and queens who condemned her are dust, her story feels awake. It does not demand justice. It does not shout. It only breathes, softly, like a candle that refuses to be extinguished. Think of her, then, not as a ghost, but as a girl who once tried to read her way out of a world that refused to listen, a girl who preferred her prayer book to her crown, who found truth in ink when there was none in politics. Jane never wanted power, but power found her. It dressed her in gold, gave her a title, and then demanded her blood to atone for its own corruption. And still, she met it with grace, not because she was fearless, but because she believed that fear was the last illusion of the flesh, and beyond it waited mercy. When you stand in the tower's chapel and feel that thin wind creeping across the stones, it's easy to imagine her still there, the faint outline of a figure in black, the tilt of a young neck beneath the blindfold, the whisper of a voice, saying the words that carried her across centuries. Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. But listen longer, and it begins to sound less like despair, and more like release, because Jane's final act was not dying. It was letting go of ambition, of shame, of everything that had been forced upon her. The world called it execution. Perhaps heaven called it freedom. The kings who followed her would raise armies. build navies, carve their names into the world. But none of them would ever own what she possessed in her last breath, that unbroken calm of conviction. And that is why, through all the years that turned her story into myth, she never disappeared. The tower may keep her bones, but England keeps her silence, that peculiar silence of a conscience that knows it once killed something too good to survive. Every February, when the fog thickens over the Thames and the stones sweat with cold, the yeomen still pause near the green. They lower their voices. They say her name like a prayer, like an apology. And in that pause, the city around them, the same city that cheered her death, grows strangely still. The hum of London fades. Even the ravens seem to listen. For a moment, time forgets itself. The air feels full, but not heavy, as if the world were exhaling at last. That is where her story belongs, not in the textbooks that list her as the 9-day queen, not in the paintings that sanctify her into porcelain stillness, but in that pause, in that hush, in the fragile breath between the living and the lost. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the girl as she was 17. Small, trembling but proud, standing against a wind that carried prayers instead of applause. Imagine her forgiving everyone, her parents, her husband's family, her queen. Imagine her choosing faith over fear in a courtyard full of men who could not look her in the eye. That is where her crown lies now, not on her head, but in her heart, and in every heart that remembers her without pity, but with quiet awe, because Jane Grey did not die as a queen. She died as something rarer. She died standing not in defiance, not in anger, but in peace. She faced the end without bitterness, without spectacle, without asking the world to weep for her. She simply walked forward, knelt, and surrendered, and by doing so, she conquered the only thing no monarch could fear itself. So when you drift to sleep tonight, let her story fall around you like the slow turning of pages. Let it remind you that courage is not thunder. It is the faint whisper of faith when the world has gone silent. That purity is not weakness. It is clarity, the kind that makes even death bow its head. And perhaps, in that final drowsy moment before dreams take you, you will hear it, not the swing of an axe, not the crowd's gasp, but the echo of a girl's voice, steady as prayer, traveling through 500 years of dust and shadow. Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And in that whisper, the story ends not with the sound of death, but with the gentle rustle of peace.